The final week of September 2025 brought a quiet crew back to the oldest temple on Earth. They were not hunting for treasure. They were repairing a wall, brushing soil away between two ancient structures on a windswept hill in southern Turkey, when the dirt gave up something it had held for 12,000 years. A human figure. Not standing. Not laid to rest in a grave. This one had been turned on its side and sealed directly into the stone of the wall itself. The head and torso intact, the feet simply gone. A face from the dawn of civilization, staring straight out of the masonry. They had buried a person inside the wall, and the question that froze the excavation was simple and chilling. Why would anyone seal a human into stone, and what else is hidden in this hill? This is Göbekli Tepe, and it was built to be buried. To understand what those restorers found, you have to picture where they were standing. This was Structure C, the largest of the great stone enclosures at Göbekli Tepe, and the work that autumn was not excavation in the usual sense. It was part of a careful conservation effort, a program the Turkish authorities called Heritage for the Future, designed to stabilize crumbling walls and re-erect leaning pillars before the elements could claim them. The team was reinforcing masonry between two of the monumental structures, the buildings archaeologists simply label B and D, when a shape began to emerge from the packed earth that did not belong to any wall. It was a carved human form, lying horizontally, pressed into the fabric of the stone itself. The discovery was announced by Turkey's Minister of Culture and Tourism, Mehmet Nuri Ersoy, and the excavation was led by Professor Necmi Karul of Istanbul University, one of the most respected names working the Neolithic sites of Anatolia. Their reading of the figure was deliberate and specific. This was no accident, no statue that had toppled from a shelf and been swallowed by debris. It had been placed there on purpose, set into the wall as the building was raised. Karol and his colleagues interpreted it as a votive offering, a sacred object woven directly into the architecture, one of the earliest direct examples anywhere on Earth of a ritual gift built into the bones of a structure. Someone, 12,000 years ago, decided that a person belonged inside the wall. The figure kept its head and its torso, but the feet were missing. And here the honest answer is that no one yet knows why. The legs may have been deliberately left off, broken away in some ritual act meant to keep the figure from ever walking out of the stone. Or the feet may simply have eroded, worn down by 12 millennia of soil and pressure and time. The artifact is still under conservation, its surface fragile, its full image withheld from the public, while specialists clean away deposits that have clung to it since before the first farmers planted the first seed. We are looking at one of the oldest human portraits ever made, and we are not yet allowed to see its whole body. What makes this figure so unsettling is not just how it was buried, it is how rare it is. Göbekli Tepe is a place of animals. For 30 years, the carvings pulled from this hill have been foxes and wild boars, snakes coiling down the pillars, scorpions, and vultures with their wings spread wide. The great T-shaped stones are crowded with the predators of the Stone Age world. Complete human beings, carved in full, are almost unheard of here. So when a human figure appears, intact, sealed into a wall rather than standing free, it lands like a single human voice in a room that had only ever spoken in the language of beasts, and the explanation refuses to come easily. Because this was not a tomb. There was no body, no bones, no burial in the way we understand it. There was a sculpture of a person, treated as something to be enclosed, contained, kept permanently inside the structure. Whatever these people believed, they believed it strongly enough to lock a human likeness into stone and build their sacred space around it. They were not decorating. They were doing something far stranger, something we are only beginning to grasp. And to understand why a people would entomb a human in a wall, you first have to understand what this place actually is, and why almost nothing about it should exist at all. Step back from the wall and look at the whole hill, and the scale of the impossibility comes into focus. The earliest construction here has been dated to somewhere around 9,600 years before the Common Era, which makes the site roughly 11,500 to 12,000 years old. Numbers that large stop meaning anything, so anchor them. This temple predates Stonehenge by about 6,000 years. It predates the Great Pyramids of Egypt by about 7,000. When the first stone was raised on this hill, there were no cities anywhere on Earth, no writing, no metal, no wheel. The pyramids were as far in the future for these builders as they are in the past for us. And that is where the real shock begins. Because the people who built this were not a lost advanced empire. They were hunter-gatherers. They had no agriculture, no domesticated herds, no pottery, no permanent towns. They lived off what they could hunt and forage, and by every assumption science held for over a century, they should not have been capable of organized monumental construction of any kind. Yet on this hill they quarried limestone, shaped it, and raised enormous T-shaped pillars, some standing more than 5 meters tall and weighing many tons each, into great circular enclosures. Then they covered those pillars in carvings rendered with a confidence that took breath away. It was a German archaeologist named Klaus Schmidt who began the systematic excavation in the mid-1990s, and who understood almost immediately that he was looking at something that rewrote the human story. The accepted timeline had always run in one direction. First, people learned to farm. Farming produced surplus food. Surplus fed larger settled populations. Settled populations eventually built temples and gods. Religion in that model was the luxury that came last, after the hard work of survival was solved. Göbekli Tepe turned that sequence on its head. Here was a monumental, sacred site built by people who had not yet learned to farm at all. Schmidt's conclusion became one of the most quoted lines in modern archaeology. First came the temple, then the city. He argued that it was not farming that drove people to gather, but the gathering itself, the pull of shared ritual and a shared sacred place, that may have pushed scattered bands to settle, to organize, and eventually to cultivate the land around them so they could keep coming back. The current excavation director, Necmi Karul, has continued to explore that idea, that the act of coming together at sites like this may have been one of the engines that tipped humanity towards settled life. The belief came first, the fields came after. It is worth being careful here. These were not gods we can name, not a faith we can reconstruct. What survives is the architecture and the iconography, the stones and the animals carved upon them. We can say with confidence that this was a place of profound ritual significance, a sanctuary that drew people across great distances. We cannot read their theology, and we should not pretend to. What we can read is the effort, the sheer, staggering labor of dragging 20-ton stones up a hill with rope and muscle and will, for no reason that filled a single stomach or sheltered a single family. Not that an advanced civilization built this, but that people we had written off as primitive built it, and forced us to admit we had the entire origin of civilization backwards. And yet, the most disturbing fact about Göbekli Tepe is not that hunter-gatherers raised it from the earth. It is what they chose to do to it when they were finished. They buried it. After centuries of use, the people of Göbekli Tepe took the temple they had labored to raise and put it back into the ground. The great enclosures, the carved pillars, the animals and the faces, all of it disappeared beneath thousands of tons of fill until the hill looked like nothing more than a low, unremarkable rise in the landscape. For nearly 12,000 years it stayed that way, a sacred place hidden so completely that the farmers who later plowed the slope above it never suspected what lay a few meters beneath their feet. The temple was not abandoned and forgotten. It was sealed. For decades, the explanation seemed almost poetic. Klaus Schmidt believed the burial was deliberate, an act of ritual closure, a ceremonial decommissioning in which a sacred space was respectfully laid to rest by the very people who had worshipped there. In that reading, the builders interred their temple the way one might bury a body, with intention and reverence. For years it was the story the world was told. They had hidden their holiest place on purpose. But honest archaeology does not stand still, and that story is now under serious challenge. The current research team from the German Archaeological Institute, including the architect Moritz Kinzel and the project's scientific head Lee Clare, has looked closely at how the fill actually behaves inside the structures, and they are no longer convinced it was shoveled in all at once. The walls nearest the slope show the worst damage, the kind of pressure and slippage you would expect from landslides and erosion, rather than a tidy ceremonial filling. Many of the great pillars lean the same direction, as if knocked by the same force. Buildings appear to have been damaged, repaired, and re-erected over a far longer span of use than anyone first assumed. In this newer view, much of the fill is simply the debris of a place collapsing and being patched again and again over generations. The neat idea of a single deliberate burial has, in their words, fallen out of favor. So which is it? A reverent sealing or a slow surrender to gravity and catastrophe? The truth is that the question is genuinely unresolved, and that uncertainty is part of what makes this hill so unnerving. We do not know whether the temple was hidden on purpose or merely swallowed by time. We only know that it vanished. And whatever the mechanism, the things that went on inside these walls leave a chill of their own. Among the bones recovered from the site, researchers led by Julia Gresky found fragments of human skulls that had been deliberately worked after death, carved with long, intentional grooves, drilled with holes. These were not casual burials. They point to what archaeologists carefully call a skull cult, some ritual treatment of the dead that involved cleaning, marking, and perhaps displaying the heads of the deceased. We do not know the meaning. We know only that the people who carved animals into 20-ton stones also carved patterns into the skulls of their own. This is not a gentle place. It is a place where the line between the living, the dead, and the divine was drawn somewhere we can no longer see. Whether sealed by reverent hands or buried by a collapsing world, the result was the same. The oldest temple on Earth disappeared beneath the dirt, and it stayed hidden until a German archaeologist recognized it for what it was. But here is the part that should genuinely unsettle you. Everything we have uncovered in 30 years of digging, every pillar, every carving, every skull, is only a sliver of what is still down there. The vast majority of Göbekli Tepe has never been touched at all. Consider what that actually means. After 3 decades of work, after every discovery that has rewritten the textbooks, archaeologists estimate that they have uncovered only a small fraction of the site. The most commonly cited figure is that more than 90% of Göbekli Tepe remains buried beneath the hill, untouched, sealed in exactly the darkness its builders left it in. Everything the world knows about the oldest temple on Earth has come from peeling back a corner of it, and we know the rest is there. Researchers have walked the slope with ground-penetrating radar and geomagnetic survey equipment, instruments that read the shapes hidden beneath the soil without disturbing a single grain of it. The results were startling. The handful of great enclosures that have been opened are not the whole temple. They are the visible edge of something far larger. The surveys detected the buried outlines of many more structures, on the order of 15 to 20 large enclosures, ringed beneath the earth, the overwhelming majority of which no shovel has ever reached. So here's the question the title of this video has been circling. If so much remains, and we have the technology to find it, why are scientists not digging it all up? Why, with dozens of buried chambers confirmed beneath their feet, do the people in charge of Göbekli Tepe refuse to open them? The answer is the most important and least sensational part of this entire story. It is not a conspiracy. It is a choice, and a deliberate one. Around the year 2020, the project shifted its entire philosophy from excavation to conservation. The priority is no longer to dig as fast as possible, but to protect and stabilize what has already been exposed. Excavation, by its nature, is destruction. The moment you lift ancient limestone out of the ground and into the open air, you begin to lose it. Sun, rain, frost, and wind go to work on stone that has been protected by soil for 12,000 years. Surfaces crack, carvings fade. Fragile material that survived 120 centuries underground can be ruined in a few seasons of exposure. The earth, it turns out, was a near-perfect preservative. So the decision was made to leave the vast majority of the site exactly where it is. Under the project led by Necmi Karul with the German Archaeological Institute's Lee Clare, excavation now happens only where research questions genuinely require it, or where a structure's stability demands intervention. New geomagnetic surveys announced in 2025 are mapping the subsoil in fine detail, not so the team can tear into it, but so that any future dig can be precise, surgical, and minimal. They are building a map of what to leave alone. When rumors circulated that the excavations had been mysteriously halted, the head of the dig publicly denied them. The work has not stopped. It has slowed on purpose. There is a hard wisdom in this. The team is, in effect, betting on the future. They are gambling that the technologies of 50 or 100 years from now will let researchers see inside those buried enclosures without ever breaking them open, reading their secrets the way a scan reads the inside of a body. Better, they reasoned, to keep the chambers sealed and intact for a generation that can study them without harm, than to rip them open now and watch them crumble in the light. The refusal to open Göbekli Tepe is not the act of someone hiding a secret. It is the act of someone protecting one. But Göbekli Tepe, it turns out, was never the only secret buried in these hills. For a long time, it was understood as a singular wonder, one impossible temple raised by one extraordinary group of people. That picture has now completely collapsed. Göbekli Tepe is the most famous member of a vast network of related sites scattered across the hills of southeastern Turkey, a whole prehistoric world that archaeologists have named Tas Tepeler, the Stone Hills. Roughly a dozen connected Neolithic sites studied under a single sprawling project that brings together around 36 institutions and more than 200 researchers. The oldest temple on Earth was never alone. It was the heart of a civilization we are only now beginning to map. And in October of 2025, just weeks after the figure was found sealed in the wall, one of those sister sites delivered a shock of its own. At Karahan Tepe, a major site about 35 kilometers east, archaeologists lifted a T-shaped pillar into its original standing position and found something never seen before in 30 years of excavating these stones: a human face, carved directly into the pillar, deep sunken eye sockets, a broad flat nose, cheeks chiseled into sharp, deliberate planes. For the first time, after 12,000 years, researchers were looking straight into a face the builders had made of themselves. The excavation director, Necmi Karul, understood at once why this mattered. For decades, archaeologists had suspected that the great T-shaped pillars were not just architecture, but stylized human bodies. The evidence was already there: arms bending down the sides of the stones, hands meeting at the front, belts and garments rendered across the shafts. Everything about them suggested a human form, abstracted into a pillar. Everything except a face. As Karul put it, the only missing element in the pattern was the face, and now that gap had been filled. He was careful with his language. The find strengthens the interpretation, supports it, deepens it. It does not, on its own, prove every theory about these stones. But after 30 years, the stone had finally looked back, and the setting told its own story. It was not found in some grand ceremonial enclosure. It sat inside a small sunken room, plastered with clay and cut down into the bedrock, alongside the ordinary grindstones of daily life. At Göbekli Tepe, the sacred and the monumental had seemed set apart from living. At Karahan Tepe, the holy and the domestic were tangled together, a carved human face presiding over a room where people ground their grain. The stone hills were not just temples, they were places where ritual lived inside the home. Karahan Tepe has been giving up astonishments like this for years. More than 250 pillars, a chamber filled with carved phallic pillars rising from the rock, snake-bodied figures emerging from walls, predators biting at human heads. At another site in the network, Seyburt, archaeologists found narrative scenes, actual stories, carved into the walls of buildings people used. Piece by piece, the stone hills are revealing a culture far richer, stranger, and more organized than anyone believed a pre-farming society could be. So now there were two faces, a figure sealed into a wall at Göbekli Tepe, and a face staring out of a pillar at Karahan Tepe, found barely a month apart. After 12,000 years of carving nothing but animals into these stones, the builders had begun, at last, to carve themselves. And that shift raises a question that cuts to the very center of the mystery. As the human form stepped out of the stone, researchers turned back to the thousands of animals carved all around it and asked the thing they had always been afraid to ask. Were these carvings simply decoration, or were they a message? Look closely at the pillars, and one thing becomes hard to dismiss. The animals are not scattered at random. The same creatures recur in the same arrangements. Foxes, snakes, scorpions, vultures, bulls, each appearing in patterns that feel deliberate, organized, almost grammatical. The builders clearly meant something by them. The agonizing question is what? And it is here, in the gap between certainty and speculation, that Göbekli Tepe has attracted some of the boldest claims ever made about the ancient world, claims we have to handle with real care. The most famous belongs to two engineers from the University of Edinburgh, Martin Sweatman and Dimitrios Tsikritsis. In 2017, they published a provocative argument about one carving in particular, Pillar 43, often called the vulture stone. They proposed that its animals were not animals at all, but constellations, star patterns mapped into stone. And they went further. They claimed the scene encoded a specific date, around 10,950 years before the Common Era, and that it commemorated a catastrophe, a comet striking the Earth and triggering a sudden plunge back into Ice Age cold. In their reading, the vulture stone was a memorial carved by survivors of a disaster from the sky. Sweatman later argued that other marks on the stones amounted to a kind of calendar. It is a spectacular story, and it has spread across the internet for years, often dressed up in claims that grow with each retelling. You may have heard that artificial intelligence scanned thousands of images of these pillars and decoded a hidden astronomical language, that a neural network confirmed the carvings matched the sky with overwhelming accuracy. Here, honesty requires a hard stop. That did not happen. There is no such study. No artificial intelligence has decoded Göbekli Tepe. That version is a fiction that grew online, layered on top of the original human argument until it hardened into something it never was. And the original argument itself is far from settled. In fact, the archaeologists who actually dig this site reject it. The Göbekli Tepe research team, including Jens Nautroff, publicly called the comet interpretation extremely far-fetched. Their criticisms are pointed. Matching a carved fox or scorpion to a modern constellation is deeply subjective, they argue, because you can find a star pattern to fit almost any shape if you go looking for one. The animals on these pillars may have meant 100 things to their makers that had nothing to do with the night sky. Even by Sweatman's own probability estimates, The match was never strong enough to count as scientific proof. So we are left with a genuine and unresolved disagreement. Some outside researchers see a star map and a warning written in stone. The people who know these stones most intimately see a creative idea imposed on carvings that were never meant to be read that way. That is the honest state of it. We cannot tell you the pillars record a comet, because they may not. We cannot tell you they encode the constellations, because the experts on this very site do not believe they do. What we can tell you is that the carvings were systematic, that they mattered enormously to the people who made them, and that their true meaning remains locked away, as buried as the 90% of the temple still under the hill. But strip away the disputed star maps and the online myths, set aside the comets and the calendars, and one hard fact remains standing underneath all of it. The world these builders lived in really was ending. And that part of the story is not speculation at all. The era in which Göbekli Tepe rose has a name. Geologists call it the Younger Dryas, and it was one of the most violent climate lurches in the entire span of human existence. Roughly 12,900 years ago, after the planet had begun warming out of the last ice age, the climate suddenly slammed into reverse. Temperatures across much of the northern world plunged back toward glacial cold in a span almost too short to believe, in places within a single human lifetime. This brutal cold snap held its grip for more than 1,000 years before releasing again, just as abruptly, around 11,700 years ago. And it was in the aftermath of that release, as the world thawed once more, that the first stones were raised on this hill. We should be careful about what caused it. You will often hear that a comet struck the Earth and triggered the Younger Dryas, and that idea, the Younger Dryas impact hypothesis, is exactly that, a hypothesis, still argued over by scientists and far from settled. But the climate upheaval itself is not in doubt. It is written into ice cores and lake beds and pollen records all over the world. The people of this region lived through a time when the familiar world was coming apart. Coastlines shifted as ice advanced and retreated. Great herds thinned and moved. The stable patterns that generations had depended on for survival fractured and reformed. These builders were living on the edge of a changing world. And here is what they did with that fear. They did not scatter. They did not simply hunker down and wait for the chaos to pass. They gathered. People who, by every assumption, should have been too few, too primitive, and too pressed by survival to attempt anything monumental. Instead, came together in numbers, dragged 20-ton stones up a hill, coordinated hundreds of hands, and built. They carved their animals into the limestone. And at the end, after generations of beasts and predators, they began to carve themselves, a face emerging from a pillar, a human figure sealed into a wall. In the middle of a world that felt like it was ending, they chose to make something that would last. That is the part of this story that needs no caveat, no disputed theory. Whatever these carvings meant, whatever rituals filled these enclosures, the impulse beneath them is one we recognize in our bones. The need to gather when the world frightens us. The need to build something permanent against the impermanence of everything else. The need to leave a mark that says, however we can manage to say it, we were here. The figure in the wall and the face on the pillar are, at their simplest, a refusal to vanish. And then, having built it, they let it go back into the earth. Whether they sealed it deliberately as a sacred act of closing, or whether the hill slowly swallowed it through collapse and landslide and time, the temple they raised against a world in upheaval ended up hidden beneath the very ground it stood on. The mark they fought to leave was buried almost as soon as it was made. For 12,000 years, it waited in the dark, holding its animals and its skulls and its sealed human figure while the climate steadied, the farms spread, the cities rose, and the entire civilization they helped set in motion forgot they had ever existed. Until a German archaeologist read the shape of a hill and understood. Until a restoration crew brushed away soil and met a face that had been waiting 12 millennia to be seen. The oldest temple on Earth may have been built, in part, to be hidden, buried by its own makers or by the catastrophe that surrounded them. And now, holding radar maps of dozens of sealed chambers and the tools to tear them open, modern science is choosing to leave them in the dark. Not from fear of a curse, but from the humble knowledge that what is exposed too soon is lost forever. The way fragile surfaces and ancient color can vanish the instant they touch the air. There is a strange irony in it. A Stone Age people who could not write their own names still managed to send a message across 12,000 years. And we can hold it in our hands without being able to read it. So I will leave the question with you. Should we open the rest? Or should some secrets stay buried? Until next time, keep exploring.